the economic aspects. So what are the possible economic consequences that the Europeans are faced with now going forward?
Well, I think that this was coming for a while, for as long as it's been clear that Russia would prevail in Ukraine, the economic and financial consequences for Europe and particularly for Great Britain were going to be quite grave. And what we know from, if you followed the news over the last 3 or 4 years, that the situation is deteriorating. It's coming on the back of not only the Project Ukraine, but also, we had the pandemic in 2020. We had gradual introduction of these net zero policies. So, for example, in Germany, they started from the year 2000. They started phasing out nuclear power plants. And they finished this on 15th April, I think, 2023 or 24, I forget. Very recently, they shut down their last nuclear power station. And then they also lost the Nord Stream pipelines, which were delivering large amounts of inexpensive, reliable supplies of natural gas from Russia for the German economy. How important was that? Well, in the words of one analyst, it was the cost of about $20 billion of Russian gas were powering the creation of $2 trillion of German final industrial products that they were then exporting to China, to the United States, and elsewhere. And now this is all in jeopardy. And the ruling establishment was hoping that they would be able to prevail in Ukraine, which would make a number of things possible. It would, they would destabilize and regime change Russia, and then they would help themselves to Russian wealth and their assets. And the $300 billion worth of Russian frozen assets, they would have kept them. They would never have returned them. Now all of this is in jeopardy. And not only, but the money that they lent, the Europeans, the money, hundreds of billions of dollars that they lent to Ukraine for the war and for defense, that would have been good debt, that those loans would be good assets. Now they're bad loans. And none of this is coming back. And what I think is even worse now, the thing that is practically a coup de grace to the Europeans, is that Trump, by reaching out to Vladimir Putin and them having a better relationship, one of the things that I think is very predictable is that the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets that are in the West, particularly in Europe, there's only about 5 to 8 billion in the United States. Everything else is practically in Europe. About 180 billion in Belgium under Euroclear. There's supposedly about $70 billion in France, about $37 billion in Britain. I think that one of the deals between Russians and the Americans is going to be that the Russians are going to invest this money in the United States. And, Donald Trump can always sweeten the deal and to say, okay, well, we'll unfreeze these assets if you invest it in the United States. We can relax some sanctions. We'll make everything better for you. And, in the same way that he has pitched the United States as an investment destination to the Saudi Arabia, to UAE and Qatar and so forth, he'll do the same for Russians. And for Russians, the move makes sense as well. And so this is going to be an additional piece of bad news for the Europeans, because the EU and Britain are in catastrophic fiscal positions. And they were counting on this money to repay some of their losses, to use that money as collateral to fuel a large new credit cycle in Europe, to, create employment, maybe fund infrastructure investment, rearmament, and things like this. Now, if this money moves overseas, then I think Europe is coming to a dead end. And the likelihood of this happening, I think, is 100%. I think it's only a matter of time, and it's probably going to happen relatively soon. And so, if the Russians say, okay, we want to move these assets to the United States, the Europeans would normally be able to say, well, sorry, no, it's frozen and you're under sanctions. But if Trump says, free up those assets and send them over to New York, the Europeans are going to have to comply. And this has always been the case. This war has only revealed the extent to which the Europeans are in a subservient position to the United States. And this is not to do with Trump. If we think back to, when was it? I think it was 2011, maybe, when there was the big scramble to catch Edward Snowden, and he was in Moscow. And then the CIA suspected that he boarded President Evo Morales's aircraft to fly out and go to Bolivia. They ordered Italy, Spain, and Portugal to close down their airspace for Evo Morales's flight, and they forced his aircraft to land in Vienna, where they kept Evo Morales and the crew of his aircraft for 14 hours while they questioned them and searched the aircraft. This was completely illegal. It was a violation of international law. But the Europeans complied with the CIA request immediately, no questions asked. That is, they broke the international law to comply with hegemon's demand. And so, that's the nature of this relationship. And if Trump tomorrow says, turn over the Russian assets, the Europeans are going to have to do it. They have no choice. Well, I always thought that the United States has a much more maneuvering space than other powers, other Western powers in this sense, and that they will be able to, let's say, manage the crisis, to engineer perhaps a soft landing. So, the debts are unpayable. There is going to be price inflation. There is going to be an economic crisis because, how do you repay $37 trillion worth of public debt? And that's just the public debt. If you take the total credit market debt, you come to something like $110 trillion. I don't know exactly what that is now, but I think it's north of $300,000 per man, woman, and child in the United States. That's preposterous. That's just simply unpayable. So you are going to have a crisis of high inflation like we had in the 70s, or maybe worse. But, the United States being a superpower, they can manage the situation in a much better way. They're sovereign. They have sovereign monetary policy. Trump can go around the world and get other nations to invest in the United States, as we discussed, and they will. The United States still has the world's dominant reserve currency and the trade settlement currency, which is the U.S. dollars. And so that gives them all kinds of ways to manage the crisis, whereas the same is not true of Japan or Britain or the EU. While it's difficult to measure these things on, let's say, on the level of aggregates, because they're, the governments are publishing nonsense numbers and you can't really believe anything. But if you look at simply at the trend of prices of sovereign bonds over the last few years, and this, the bond prices started to go into a bear market in the summer of 2021. So this pretty much coincided with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is when I thought that the empire sustained a fatal wound. The British, European, Japanese bonds started to go into a bear market, and American ones as well. But if you look 5 years later, the American bonds declined maybe 20% or so from the peak, and you looked at the European bonds, sustained a much, much bigger loss, and the British bonds even worse than that. And so it's telling you that the markets, over time have marked Great Britain and possibly Japan as the most vulnerable nations, as the first dominoes to fall, and that the confidence in the U.S. system, U.S. economy, and their debt is still the highest among the Western nations. So ever since the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, I've always believed that the Great Britain is exactly the weak link in the Western world.